Good evening. Welcome to the another edition of the Inequality Conversations. Today we have Mr. Sriram Balasubramanian talking to us. The title of his talk is Matsya Nyaya through the Kautilyan lens, a discussion on Kautilya's views on inequality. Sriram Balasubramanian is a graduate of the Columbia University and a well-known economist and an author. This is his third book. He has two prior books. And he's been a regular columnist for Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, and also a panelist on the CNBC TV again. Today's session is being moderated by Professor Mahadevan, who by his own right is a Sanskrit scholar and also understands the original text as much as the new thing. Mr. Sriram has come out with a new book, Kautilyanomics for the Modern Times. And this talk is based on a chapter of the book, and you could check out for the book as well as we go along. Mr. Sriram would talk about the topic for about 25-30 minutes, after which Professor Mahadevan will moderate the Q&A session. Thanks a lot. I welcome Mr. Mahadevan, Professor Mahadevan to take over and moderate the session. Thank you.
It's extremely good and my pleasure to be part of this edition of Inequality Conversation. And we have with us Sriram Balasubramanian. Can I request you to come on stage, Sriram? Welcome, Sriram. It's my pleasure to, our pleasure to have you here. Just for the sake of sort of a little continuity, as Professor M. Sriram already mentioned, Sriram Balasubramanian has recently authored a book, Kautilyanomics. I had the fortune of sort of going through it quickly. A very interesting and a very thought-about work, where I could sense that some very good concepts from the Kautilyan work of Arthashastra, especially in the domain of economics. And what is interesting that I found in the book is while these ideas in Arthashastra are being discussed, alongside, I think, mapping it onto some of the current realities, I think that's a very good part of it. So with this brief introduction, we all know Kautilya is a very important contribution, and we are extremely happy that to have this particular talk today. Over to you, Sriram Balasubramanian, and can you please share your thoughts with us, and then we'll follow up with the QA after your initial sort of introducing the ideas. Is that fine? Is that okay?
Namaste to all your viewers. Thank you, Professor Mahadevan, for the introduction, and Professor M. Sriram as well for inviting me for this lecture. It's an honor to present, and I'm glad to be part of the scholars around. Let me just open up my presentation. It'll be just a quick presentation. I'll try to be as brief as possible. So as I mentioned, it's great to be here. Just a disclaimer, these are my personal views and they shouldn't be attributed to any organizations or the panelists that I'm affiliated to. So the title itself is, I found it fascinating when I was discussing with Professor Sriram on the idea of Matsya Nyaya through the Kautilyan lines. So there is a sort of a, the idea of Matsya Nyaya is something I sort of segue in various chapters in my book. So it was sort of an interesting topic. So I'll just run through the motivation of the book and provide a quick overview of what the book is, and then segue into the discussion of Matsya Nyaya and importance to Kautilya, and also the Kautilyan approach to inequality. I think this is important to understand the motivation because this chart, which I think you're able to see, is something that I came upon while researching on Angus Maddison's dataset. Angus Maddison is a well-known, world-renowned historian, economic historian, and he had conceptualized, or he had worked on a data set which gave macroeconomic numbers, GDP per capita numbers from 0 CE onwards till about 17th, 18th century. So for about 1,000 years, he sort of provided this database. In that database, you sort of, this chart basically represents a summary of that, where you see India and China. India is in gray and China is in orange, alternate each other in terms of the scale till about 17th century, in terms of the GDP numbers. So this was sort of fascinating to me. I'm aware of the sort of the contrarian view to this, saying that industrial revolution didn't happen, the scale of the economy was much lesser, and most of it is a proxy for population. But simultaneously, you had a lot of accounts from scholars and travelers, say within India, within the subcontinent, whether it's the Chinese, whether it's the Greeks, who would talk about how prosperous this land was. So my intuitive understanding while I was working on this data set is that there had to be sort of some sort of an economic framework which sort of facilitated this growth. My intuitive view was it wasn't something random, that there was a reasonably level of sophisticated thinking to sort of ensure that this continuum of prosperity was there. So this was probably the main motivation. And then I chanced upon the Arthashastra text itself, and realized that very few was written about the Artha part of it. And most of it is focused on either geopolitics or it is focused on fiction, or it's focused on self-help sort of books. So the combination of these two factors sort of set me into motion to understanding the text, the Sanskritam text, and then working with Sanskritam scholars, translating the text, and then using economic financial principles to sort of lay out a framework and then contextualize it in today's times so that it's available for everyone to see. So this motivation is what sort of made me work on this for many years, because we had to get each of these buckets right, and then establish an analytical framework which has academic rigor as well as contextualizes today's times. So these are the sort of broad motivations for the book. As I mentioned, we talk about in the book, I talk about economic frameworks. Then I talk about the idea of dharmic capitalism, essentially the role of dharma being foundational to sort of Kautilya's economic worldview, and the principles of dharma which sort of act as a self-correcting mechanism both for the state and the market. And within the bucket of dharmic capitalism, there are three sort of big buckets. One is a rule-enforcing yet non-intrusive state. Another is the idea of wealth creation through sort of a global approach. Another is sort of sustainable growth and welfare. I think that's the focus. The last sort of bucket is the focus of our discussion today, because in the chapter within welfare, I sort of deal with the idea of Matsya nyaya. Matsya nyaya, I think, is probably well known. The shloka that refers to it is right there. I don't want to get too much into Sanskritam, so I'll just leave that for your reading. But in a sense, a simplified sort of translation of this shloka is that in the absence of law and order and enforcement of punishment, the strong sort of swallow the weak, but under the protection, the weak is protected from the strong. So essentially, the law of fishes, as they call it, is that Kautilya was very keen to avoid, Matsya nyaya from being, engulfing his sort of empire. So what he suggested was to implement the rule of law to ensure that, that doesn't happen. But that's only one element of Matsya nyaya. Another element of Matsya nyaya is, again, the idea of the small and the big fish that we talk about in a sense of inequality. And that interpretation is something I sort of segue into one of the chapters, where Kautilya firmly believed that the welfare of the common man was very important. And folks at the lower end of the economic spectrum need to have a set of, enabling mechanisms which sort of made them, which sort of ensured that the gap between the rich and the poor is not too wide. So that is a sort of a foundational principle to Kautilya's thinking. So his approach to inequality had, again, four big buckets. Again, I'm trying to be a bit simplistic, but I hope the message comes across. The first part of his sort of approach to inequality is targeted redistribution. So Kautilya believed in the idea of redistribution, but he didn't believe in sort of universal transfers. He believed in the idea of targeted transfers, in my view. So that is one sort of bucket. Another idea is the idea of flexible minimum wage. We've heard a lot about minimum wages across the world. I mean, the United States, we talk about $15 minimum wage. In India, there is also discussions about a rural sort of urban minimum wages. Kautilya had this idea of a flexible minimum wage where it doesn't have a fixed number, but the number keeps evolving based on a set of circumstances, whether it's geopolitical or macroeconomic. The third sort of bucket is incentives and protection for labor. So, he believed that, protection for labor and incentives are very important. And even folks at the lowest end of the spectrum need to be protected in terms of labor contracts, in terms of transparency, in terms of incentives provided even for folks at the lowest level of the economic spectrum. And the last point is to expand opportunity for the needy. He believed that enabling and empowering people was an important part of addressing the issue of inequality. So if you look at a targeted redistribution of the poor, I think, as I mentioned, he believed in the importance of redistribution was opposed to sort of a universal approach. So in very simplistic terms, he sort of believed in the principle of meritocracy and acknowledged the idea of risk aversion and shirking, and sort of felt that people had to be provided incentives to enable and work. And if everyone is provided free sort of freebies, he felt that they might be too lackadaisical in that sense. So sort of a modern day version of DBT, direct benefit transfer, compared to sort of a universal basic income, is something that he would have preferred. And so a targeted redistribution for the poor was one sort of significant component of his idea. Another is the idea of flexible minimum wage. So if you look at the table on the box on the right, it sort of gives you some gradations of Kautilya's salary grades within the government. And there were various gradations of these salaries. So you have, which ranges from, say, 60 panas, which is probably the lowest end of the spectrum, till about 48,000 panas. And within each of these grades, he had a sort of a minimum sort of a cutoff for wages in those grades. And each of these were adjusted depending on the circumstances. So for example, his focus was basically on real wages. So if you take the United States again as an example today, a $15 minimum wage is very different when inflation is at, say, 8-9% compared to when inflation is at 2%. So the real sort of value of the minimum wage matters. So Kautilya sort of implicitly understood this concept. So he felt that this idea of a minimum wage should be catered to income levels, and it should be also flexible. So depending on a variety of other indicators, this sort of moves and changes. So the third bucket, which we spoke about, is incentives and protection for labor. So incentives, again, I think is an important component, and protection is also important. He felt that protection for labor is something that empowers individuals. For example, there's a direct quotation which talks about an agreement between a laborer and one hiring that individual needs to be made public. So for example, if there's a huge construction site and there's a laborer who's, say, getting 100 rupees per day, for example, the broad agreement for those type of day-to-day laborers needs to be made public so that people can understand what the contractual obligations are. So there has to be sort of a prior agreement agreed upon, even for people at a lower end of the spectrum. So this sort of an approach ensured that laborers got a labor had some say in the arrangement between the employer and the employee. And this sort of empowered people at the lower end of the spectrum. So he believed in transparency of such contracts and things. And the idea of incentives. So even, for example, there are quotations about weavers where, where they were provided incentives and gifts to sort of incentivize them to do well in Kautilyan times. So, and there are many quotations in the text in other subsections, which talks about the need for empowering the poor, and then ensuring that the sort of the bigger fish, as you call it, the employer doesn't take undue advantage of the employee. So this is something that you see across the text. This was another sort of bucket to his thinking. And then expanding opportunities for the needy. He was always, advocating, education and equality of support through decentralized government model. I think this is important to emphasize, because most of the Kautilyan sort of a governance model was largely village-based, in the sense it was highly decentralized. So you had people in villages who sort of had their own sort of networks and various ecosystems, which sort of enabled a bottom-up sort of chain in terms of opportunities. So he believed that the more decentralization happens, the more localized opportunities would be there for people. And then diversifying skill sets. There was a variety of skill sets that he focused on, explored people to sort of look at all these areas. And the idea of wealth creation is another sort of important component in this, because Kautilya had a sort of a global approach. There's a lot of international trade that is happening during Kautilyan times. You had Greeks trading spices, and you had folks from Middle East, folks from China, all of them doing trade during those times. So, and Kautilya provided a lot of incentives. I mean, he provided tax incentives for traders. He provided a lot of incentives for importers, provided support in terms of internal trade if they want to move from one place to another. And he constantly sort of encouraged the idea of an international sort of trade, international approach. So this sort of ensured that one of the aims of this was also to ensure that people across the supply chain, even at the lower levels, sort of got the opportunities to be part of this ecosystem. So he constantly encouraged that idea. So his focus was also, sort of expanding the opportunities for the needy. So broadly, these four buckets. One is, we spoke about targeting redistribution for the poor. Another bucket, we spoke about the idea of protection in terms of a minimum wage, sort of a flexible minimum wage protection. Another bucket is on the idea of protection in terms of labor, where labor gains, or at least is on par with capital in terms of how the economy functions. And then the idea of expanding opportunities for the needy through a variety of initiatives and schemes. So these were, broadly, I would say, the four big buckets of Kautilyan approach to inequality. And this might be a bit simplified for a presentation, but for more details, it'd be great, if you can buy the book and sort of read through it. And that's probably my last slide. Just a couple of quotations on the book, which have reviews that have come. So with this, I sort of wrap up my presentation, and we'll be glad to answer questions, have a discussion.
You kept it really very short and sweet, very nicely. You had put a few issues on the table. Let me, let me look at the chat box, whether there are, I think we are yet to see, questions being populated. So in the meanwhile, let me start with, I think what I really like is the title of your talk. Because as you sort of, making that observation, I think Kautilya clearly mentioned this Matsya nyaya. That's a very powerful term that he used. You quoted the shloka also. And the fact that the reality of a larger enterprise, including up to a nation, is Matsya Nyaya is inevitable. Obviously, you have all kinds of power, imbalances which are quite characteristic of a larger, enterprise, nation state, and those kinds of things. But there's one issue which I thought maybe I should sort of check with you. Since Kautilya brought this very reference of Matsya Nyaya in his introduction on Danda. Basically, when he started the justice and the law and all enforcement, which you also sort of mentioned when you were talking. So I was wondering, while certainly I think these 3-4 blocks are very interesting to sort of look through the lens of Matsya Nyaya, I was wondering, is there a scope for us to think about this concept of Matsya Nyaya as a larger and a generic principle of a variety of situations in which there is a potential possibility of two transacting entities, and one transacting entity inherently is likely to have more power? Of course, you gave specific examples like labor and all that, but I was wondering whether Kautilya's perspective was that if you take a view that in a variety of transactions, there could be potentially a powerful entity and the other transacting partner can be relatively sort of less powerful, so to say, then there is a mechanism required to make sure that the bigger fish does not eat up the smaller fish. Do you think that kind of a sense is there when he spoke about? Because it interestingly came under law and justice, actually, among other things.
Let me answer your question in sort of 2 to 3 pillars. The first is, you're right, it is predominantly viewed through the idea of law and justice, because of the 2 quotations that we have sort of mentioned about Matsya Nyaya. But I think that is the challenge with a text like the Arthashastra, because it has many layers under it. Meaning, you could have his approach of Matsya Nyaya as an approach, not explicitly mentioning it, but the thinking is there in other areas of the text. So I find, especially using techniques like Tantra Yukti, for example, and other sort of, logical based techniques, that we are able to decipher more and more of his thinking on this subject. So you're right in saying that much of the Matsya Nyaya discussion is on the implementation of law and ensuring that legal sort of implementation, enables the big and the bigger entities to be, the smaller entities to have a fair share of what have a fair share of things. But it also, the broader picture of the bigger entity taking undue, or the gap between the big and the small person becoming bigger, is also something that he's aware of. So Kautilya acknowledges the fact that in a dynamic between, say, the bigger corporate player and the smaller person, there's always going to be that uneven balance. And he sort of acknowledges that. But his focus is on the mechanisms that are in place. So that's why, for example, in the chapter on enforcement of contracts, I also again mention about the idea of Matsya Nyaya there. There I sort of, focus on how he ensures that the processes are in place. So, for example, if Kautilya was there today, he would ensure that the legal sort of framework and processes ensure that a common person has enough rights and responsibilities, and they're able to sort of have a due process, to put it that way. So my answer to your question is that his idea would be, he acknowledges that the larger entity always has undue sort of advantage, and it was the role of the state or the role of the system sort of ensure that the smaller entities are given a fair shot in the entire process. So that they are sort of given due process for whatever challenges that they want to make in the system. And the last point is he also viewed this as a sign of confidence in the system. Because of the fact that his entire treatise was focused on the idea of commerce, he believed that if these principles of Matsya are not, or dealing with Matsya are not taken seriously, then people who are doing this businesses and trade and things like that wouldn't have confidence in the system. So I think that was also a sort of a bigger picture goal that he had in mind, to ensure that people had confidence in the system, whether it's the common man or whether it is the businessman who's doing business in the kingdom that he oversaw.
That's really interesting. I think that the last point that you alluded was really interesting, because in book 4 of Arthashastra, for example, in the first chapter of book 4, there are very interesting sort of observations that Kautilya makes. For example, he says that artisans and craftsmen, for example, or goldsmiths, etc., they are prone to cheat public. That kind of observations, we find there. Also, deficiency of service. We today also we see many of these things, and so that's why I was asking. Here is a situation where there is a B2C kind of a transaction happening, and in some ways, I think Kautilya was so sensitive to even a possibility that the other side of the trade can become a little stronger. Say he put very protective mechanisms to prevent such things being happening. I think so. I was wondering whether this Matsya Nyaya really pervaded into a variety of situations that he had discussed, although under the garb of law and justice and so on.
See, the thing is, he was also a very smart, astute political economist, right? So he saw, economic prosperity, artha, as a sort of a goal for greater political success. So it was the foundation. And the foundation of the artha was based on dharma. That is another subject altogether. But so the thing is, so in that sense, he felt that the welfare of the people was the most important thing. He wanted to ensure that the people were happy and were contented in general. So that was his primarily sort of goal. So for that to be achieved, he also felt that the people shouldn't be always overthrown by the state or by the big entities where they feel there's a lack of opportunity, lack of fairness. So these sort of principles was something which you see across the text. And you would, so that's why I keep mentioning that it is a strong state, but a state that doesn't intervene. You have strict rules and regulations. If you follow those rules and regulations, that's great. But if you sort of violate these rules and regulations, then the punishment is severe. But he doesn't sort of micromanage on the activities that people were doing. So, but the role of the state is to ensure that the common person sort of felt comfortable, felt empowered, felt confident about the system. And that was foundational. That's why you see the idea of Matsya Nyaya resonating everywhere, whether it's in inequality, whether it's in labor contracts, whether it is in even corporate sort of disputes and trade disputes between countries, for example, or for people who are coming from various places. So, for example, foreigners who come in to the country, they're given protection in terms of some of these liabilities. So he sort of permeated this across various sectors. But in some cases, he explicitly mentions it, since the rule of law is sort of is the base. But his idea of empowering the poor and sort of taking care of the poor's welfare was central to the Arthashastra. In fact, I would even say that the idea of kingship he clearly mentions that the king is basically the servant of the people. And if the king is not competent, his progeny is not competent, then then he would replace the king and the progeny with someone more competent, because he felt that the king's main sort of sovereign responsibility is to take care of the people, and his income or whatever it is sort of a salary for that, rather than him owning anything. So his approach to every area, whether it's statecraft, whether it is economics, whether it is within economics, trade, inequality, or whatever it is, was focused on empowering the lower sections of people. It could be purely because he was very astute politically, because he felt that that's how that the political prosperity could be facilitated. But I think there was a genuine, you make a fair point, I think there was a genuine sort of segue or sort of you could see this across various chapters in the book. And he's also very practical, like the quotations that you mentioned in chapter 4, where he clearly acknowledges that people are flawed, including himself. So he acknowledges all of those things and yet tries to build a system which can remain more or less fair.
Here is a question which says, what was the broad concept of taxation and how was it linked to redistribution, since we talked about redistribution, and was the taxation levels high? I think let us start with this question.
That's an important question. Taxation, he felt, was an important revenue source, no doubt. But broadly speaking, he had a rate of taxation about 1/6, about 15 to 20% was his broad sort of 15 to 25%, depending on ranges. He believed that people can't be taxed beyond their, because he believed that people had a threshold for taxation. In the sense, beyond a particular point, if you start taxing people, he felt that there would be, issues with people will get irritated by the imposition of these taxes. So he genuinely felt that there was a threshold, a tolerance threshold among people. So it's like a nectar and honey story. So his rates were generally between the 15 to sort of 25% range, and the rates were not too complicated. I mean, he had rates for, in those days, there's agriculture. I mean, you also taxed agriculture, there's taxes on trade. There are components of these taxes, but the buckets were more or less within sort of this range of 15 to 25%, which is, I think, similar to some of the rates that we have today. In terms of redistribution, again, he was practical. He felt that you couldn't increase tax beyond a point to enable redistribution. So he felt that, within this particular range, if he was able to tax specific people, probably the higher income people, then he could redirect some of the income back to redistribute back to the lower income level folks. But I think he focused more on the implementation of these taxes, meaning on the processes needed to ensure that there's greater compliance in taxation among people. And then he focused on redistribution. So rather than expanding the tax net by increasing the rates, I think his focus would have been to sort of implement increase the compliance for taxation, and ensure that people are compliant and they pay their taxes on time, and then use those resources to sort of redistribute in a targeted way. So I think that was his approach. So broadly speaking, this would be his sort of philosophy on taxation.
Was the redistribution through commonly provided facilities, things like infrastructure or social infrastructure, such things, or more oriented to individual redistribution like UBA kind of mechanisms? I think you did discuss a little bit about this in the presentation, but maybe little more clarity would help, I guess. Probably that's why I discussed.
Yeah, I didn't make a mention in the presentation. So if you compare, say, between, in today's terms, just to simplify it a bit, between sort of a direct benefit transfer and a universal basic income. So direct benefit transfer is you transfer to certain sections of people for certain sort of events or response to events as sort of income to sort of support them. Whereas a universal basic income is a basic income for everyone. There is a rich, poor, you give a flat amount, let's say per month or per year, and you do that for X number of years or X number of months. So what Kautilya would advocate or would think about is sort of the DBT approach. And that's where the decentralized governance system sort of helped. Because obviously in those days, you didn't have technology, you didn't have the kind of scale that we can do today. So a decentralized sort of system ensured that you had treasuries which are sort of more decentralized, which can sort of enable greater delivery of these resources. So in those days, it could be either through panas, which is basically coins, which can be transacted elsewhere, or this could be through food and other sort of, items that can benefit people. So it is sort of a combination of both. But the mechanism to do it was the decentralized system in villages, which enabled them to access it to large sections of the population, to assess the need, and then provide to people who needed it, so that the scale is not too much for them to deal with in a sort of decentralized model. So in terms of mechanisms, I would say that it is a combination of both cash and in kind, cash in today's terms and in kind, and the targeting was basically enabled because they had very strong networks at the decentralized level, which sort of enabled them to ensure that the people received whatever that was received. And obviously all of this aggregated to a central level where, the treasury sort of got a sense of what is happening. For example, they had statistics offices in these. When I mean statistics, obviously there's no macro models and huge complicated systems that we have today, but you had people who were sort of delegated to go to individual villages to understand, say, price points, to understand what is happening with price of products or understanding the demand scenario. So all of these offices sort of, in these decentralized places came together and then sort of gave a report or some sort of an understanding for a centralized treasury, which sort of then made decisions. For example, there are even, quotations in other texts which talks about money supply and how Kautilya sort of adjusted money supply, money in those terms, in those years, adjusted that money supply to play around with to adapt to macroeconomic changes. So yeah, this would be my broad answer to your question.
Okay. There is another issue which I thought you will be in a much better position to sort of clarify. See, when I was going through this Arthashastra book, there was this sense, and I am not an economist, I'm not even a financial management expert or sort of person. What I realized is there are a variety of taxing mechanisms. So one thing is taxes were lower, but the fact was a very large list. You have import duty, export duty, equivalent of octroi, and those kinds of things. Countervailing duty equivalents. You have monopoly tax surcharges. Then there is a lot of fees and service charges for weights and measures. But at least fees and service charges I can understand. In the context of our current thinking in terms of fewer taxing mechanisms, lower rates, and so on, For example, even in India, we have removed the turnover tax, the octroi, and all kinds of things. And we have been graduating towards a GST and those kinds of fewer kind of taxing mechanism. So how would you look at this kind of prescriptions that you see in Arthashastra in the light of this?
Yeah. So that's another sort of challenge on the role of the state, right? Because he had some of these detailed detailed prescriptions like what you mentioned, in terms of the wide variety of taxes that he had in place. The question really is whether all of these taxes were implemented at one go, or when at various levels he sort of advocated only to use certain taxes depending on the scenario. That is something I'm still sort of grappling about to sort of get a sense. But my sense is he had a very detailed understanding of this. It's a very detailed state. It's a very so the state which is very well defined. So as part of the definition, he's put in a variety of these things. How much of it was implemented, or how much of was it implemented in a practical sort of governance, is another question. Because the Arthashastra itself is context agnostic. I mean, you don't find, at least to my knowledge, you don't find references to, say, the Mauryan dynasty within the text itself. It is sort of written in a way where I wouldn't even say that the Mauryans actually implemented everything that the Arthashastra said. I think Kautilya was sort of felt that, he needed to make a text on his own, which is sort of irrespective of which era it was, and it sort of had to speak for itself. So some of these things, it might be theoretical. It's like having theoretical constructs that we have today in economics. It doesn't mean that we use all of them. There could be some situations where he uses some of them, and some situations where he doesn't. But I do agree that the idea of simplifying taxes, making it much more simpler, is something that we are, that probably needs to be done. That's one factor in Arthashastra. It needs to be done even more, because there are a wider variety of taxes, complex taxes, which is mentioned. It reflects a lot on his thought, but I think a simplification of that is required. On the other hand, I also doubt how much of this was actually implemented, because a lot of this is theoretical, and whether he would implement everything at one go. So that sort of a dynamic is something which is, again, something we need to explore.
Thank you. I think it's a very interesting issue that whether we should implement all of them in one
go. No, because for example, right, say he's going to tax agriculture, right, and for some reason there was a very bad monsoon that year. I don't think from whatever that I've seen of Kautilya's ideas and his flexibility to ideas, I don't think he would tax them at really high rates during a very bad monsoon. He might really reduce the taxes during that monsoon too, so that people get relief, and he might sort of adjust the other rates to ensure that people are not really annoyed by his taxation. So yeah, so I think that is another thing we need to be cognizant, whether all of these principles, academic sort of principles, are implemented, in together, or they're implemented in different situations in different manners.
Here is an interesting question. Since this whole discussion there that we are doing in the context of this inequality report, which we have been using for this series of talks and so on. So in that context, this person is asking, I was wondering if Kautilya had any views on wealth tax and inheritance tax. Of
course, I was waiting for that question or sort of, answer that. Yeah, so he did. Okay, let's take wealth and inheritance as two sort of buckets, right? In terms of wealth, he didn't advocate special rates for people above a certain income levels, but he definitely believed that people who are wealthy had to pay whatever that was due. So the implementation of taxes, the strictness of taxes, compliance was much higher for people who are in much higher income levels. So in that sense, he did have a sort of a more sort of rigor for people who are wealthy in terms of compliance. In terms of inheritance, yes, I mean, for example, there are quotes in the text which talk about, for example, a king's assets, whether it goes to his son, he talks about inheritance, the conditions of inheritance. So, and what are some of the things that, that people need to do to inherit some of the properties and things like that. So he doesn't explicitly mention anything about an inheritance tax, but I think he would be someone who definitely sort of look at the idea of an inheritance tax in an open sort of way. I don't think he would be sort of he wouldn't have some sort of anathema towards it, is the sense that I am getting, because he believed, especially inheritance for the rich was something that was something that that isn't always a status quo. That because the idea of a wealth tax compared to an inheritance tax, I think would be more appealing to him. But an inheritance by status quo is not something that he sort of agreed with. Just on this point of taxation, I'm just looking at some of my older work on this. So he talks about Kara, which is sort of a general income tax, Bhaga, which is on tax on income payable in cash and sort of a wealth tax, and Bali and Vyagi, which is like a sort of a sales tax, and Udakabhaga, which is again sort of a water tax. So these are some examples of taxations that he talked about. And then there's also business and corporate tax. For example, merchants were taxed regularly, on gems, jewels, mining, and trading sectors. For example, gold, silver, and gems, there was a particular rate, about say 50 panas. So for each of these sections, he had a certain sort of rate for some of these corporates. So it's not like he gave a free sort of ride for the corporates, but he so he did have some of these broad buckets of taxation. So answering the question on wealth and inheritance tax, I think a wealth tax is definitely something that he would probably think about. I haven't seen evidence of an inheritance tax per se, but he would definitely, I think, ensure implementation is much more stricter for the more wealthy.
Okay, so speaking of these wealthy people in the society, in that context, when we spoke about wealth tax and so on, what we find in Arthashastra, some people actually are a little concerned about those aspects of Arthashastra in some ways, is during periods of extreme famine or, failure of the crops and things of that kind. I think Kautilya has certain recommendations which more or less amounts to saying we'll need to rob off these rich and take some money out of them. That kind of broadly, that kind of I don't know how would you look at it. I mean, do you have anything to say on that?
Heard about this, and I haven't looked at those exact quotations to probably comment on it, but my sense is Kautilya acknowledges that he is as flawed as probably us in terms of our thinking. So there is a good chance that there are some prescriptions which even through the economic lens, which are not probably applicable to today's times, and also probably not probably sometimes contradicting as well, because there are some things which he would have done from a political perspective, and that might contradict some of his economic prescriptions. But I think in the case of the famine or the natural disasters that you're talking about, I think that the sense that I get is it could be that it's probably a stronger way of him saying that if there's a complete calamity, then the other sort of the people who have the wealth need to contribute to sort of improve the lives of other people. But the way it is probably said is a bit more, much more aggressive. But in general, I've not found him to be, because the Arthashastra as a whole, at a conceptual level, encourages wealth. It doesn't, it encourages wealth prosperity. It reinforces many times. In fact, in the text, he argues in quite a few instances about how his thoughts vary from, say, Shukracharya and Brihaspati and things like that, and how where he agrees, where he disagrees. But one area where he's very consistent is the role of Artha and the role of prosperity and wealth. So his general philosophy is to enable and ensure that wealth and prosperity are encouraged. If that is the case, I find it difficult, except for extraordinary circumstances like this, where there's a natural disaster and things like that. I find it difficult to sort of think that he would discourage people or sort of take away people's wealth for whatever reason. So my sense is this section is probably an anomaly in general compared to his view on wealth and things like that.
Here is another question. Let me go over it. How about corruption? Was it there, and how was it controlled?
Yeah, that's an important, I think, bucket of his. Of course, corruption was there. I think corruption in any society was there. It's a question of, at any point of time, it's a question of how much and at what point of time. So I think his idea of dharma was basically, if you read the book, I sort of put dharma, I define dharma through three sort of big buckets. One is the idea of ethics, one is the idea of responsibilities, and another is the idea of harmony and global harmony. So he believed that the role of these three sort of buckets, the focus on ethics, in terms of leadership, in terms of governance mechanisms, transparency, in terms of rule of law, if all these things were sort of in place, then the possibilities of corruption is very low. The possibilities of bribery is very low, because if you commit bribery, the rule of law takes care of, if there's proper rule of law, then that takes care of itself. People are scared to commit bribery. If the punishments are really extreme, like some of his punishments are really extreme, people are again scared to commit crimes. So, and they also know that he's going to implement it as he says. So the implementation is also strict. So in that sense, the role of dharma, or the components of dharma, which he defined, one of the aims is also to ensure that that corruption doesn't seep into society. So that's why he even says for government officials that he would monitor some of their activities and ensure that have these random visits, sometimes even spies who are sent in to ensure that they're not corrupt. So I think his focus on corruption, he was shrewd enough to understand corruption was a significant issue, but he focused on systems to sort of ensure that the corruption doesn't go beyond a particular level. So I wouldn't say corruption was eliminated, but I definitely see the role of dharma playing an important role in the components of it to sort of reduce the amount of corruption as much as possible. And that's why you find his focus on transparency, his focus on rule of law, implementation of rule of law, his focus on contracts, his focus on some of these punishments. All of this is to give a sense of doing the right thing. And that, I think, was important from his perspective.
We conclude with a question. I remember your book ends with a very interesting chapter. How Kautilya would view the post-pandemic world. So, could you sort of summarize some of the things that you have expressed through that chapter? I think that would be very interesting for the audience to hear.
Yeah, because the reason why I wrote the chapter is because I am learning as much as your audience. Just that probably I'm because of the time I spent on the book, on the text and the nuances, I'm probably an advanced learner, right? So when I was looking at this world and a post-pandemic world, I sort of wrote the chapter to sort of think out loud on what Kautilya would have thought, or rather what I would have thought Kautilya would have thought in that chapter. So for example, just for the benefit of the listeners, I sort of take three big issues. One is on the idea of demographics, in the sense that India is one of the youngest populations in the world at the moment. But if you take, say, 30, 40 years down the line, it might be one of the oldest populations in the world. So how would Kautilya react to an aging society, for example? What are some of the questions that one would ask Kautilya? How would he deal with aging? Would redistribution go to another level where it includes even age-based redistribution? How does he think about revitalizing, say, the economy, because it becomes an aging economy? Another bug is artificial intelligence. What are some of the impacts of artificial intelligence, say, on employment, on protecting the poor, and what Kautilya would do? And also another section on debt sustainability, on the issue of debt. He talks a lot about personal debt and the need to be sustainable personally. There's also issue of sovereign debt, which is another area I'm still exploring. So these are questions which I sort of ask in the chapter. I mean, it sort of reflects my thinking of what I am asking Kautilya, which probably I would research more, is to get a sense of, because the entire sort of point of this exercise, of this book, is to do a couple of things. One, have discussions like this to sort of bring the idea of Kautilya's ideas, economic ideas, to the table to debate, discuss. Second is to look at some of the ideas that we can use in today's world. For example, there are a lot of these dharmic nudges which I talk about, which you can sort of implement, which can enhance the efficiency of implementation. So, for example, if you take the Swachh Bharat initiative, for example, the idea of a cleanliness drive, essentially at a very basic level, is to sort of induce your dharmic sort of instinct of cleanliness, both for yourself and society, and sort of make you aware, and then you take care of yourself and society, and then there are lots of other additional outcomes, better sanitation, better cleanliness, better health outcomes for people, which make sure that society as a whole gets enhanced. So some of these ideas that Kautilya had to sort of trigger people's instincts for better outcomes are some things that we can take home. I think that is important in that in our sort of future applications of Kautilya's thinking, because these nudges can take the efficiency of policy, which is at 80%, to say 90%. The last mile of the policy effectiveness can be enhanced, I feel, especially in a society like India, which is highly Bharat, which is highly culturally driven, where cultural norms determine economic choices. which in turn aggregate to the macroeconomy. So if some of these nudges can be implemented, even the issue of climate change, climate change fundamentally is a behavioral thing. Unless me and Professor Mahadevan, for example, take our own initiatives to protect the climate environment as a whole wouldn't be protected. So triggering these behavioral instincts and triggering these ideas. So this is where I think Kautilya's thinking could be used to enhance. So how you can do that in sort of a post-pandemic world for some of the big challenges that we are seeking is probably an exercise which can help us to sort of figure out better ways to do these things. And lastly, I think one is very aware, I'm very aware that the context is very different. I mean, our technology, our data systems, our complexity is far more complex than those times. But fundamentally, we are still individuals as human beings. And much of economic activity is a subset of individual choices, which are determined more or less by instincts that individuals have. So in that sense, I think some of these principles could be brought to debate, and then we could sort of explore how these could be applicable for the future as well.
Thank you, Sriram Balasubramanian. On that note, I think there are very interesting dimensions to look forward and perhaps take the key concepts that Kautilya laid a couple of thousand years back. I'm sure these 3-4 leads that you are talking about are very interesting to sort of expand our thinking, drill deeper into Kautilya, and see if we have a perspective which could sort of contribute or improvise our understanding of where we should be going forward and so on. Thank you for this opportunity. Over to Professor Sriram.
Thanks a lot, Sriram, for this wonderful interaction and talk.